Well, here we are now in this moving vehicle, making a target for Dan, very like the Israelis moving forward to attack the Egyptians in Sinai. Must have made for the Egyptians.
Thank you. For a novice like me, a javelin is easier to handle than a saga. When a saga was fired, it trailed a control wire behind it, and the operator used a joystick which had to keep steering the missile until it reached its target.
I think I can see something now.
A hit required good training and a steady hand.
I was going to have a pop at them.
With the javelin, all I have to do is get the truck in the sights, lock the guidance system onto it, and fire.
No, it's just popped out now. You just see the smoke from his exhaust.
Activating the seeker.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to go for it.
Go for it.
At least, that's the theory.
God, it's tricky with that wobble when you just try and get the track gates on the target. Did I miss?
Fortunately, that's a no result, which means you've missed.
I really had no idea where Dan was.
This is where your speed jewel starts to come into it now.
His state-of-the-art javelin can hit my vehicle from over 2 kilometers away, a similar range to the Sagas in 1973. No wonder the Israeli tank drivers were taken by surprise as they headed towards the Suez Canal. They simply couldn't see the Egyptians lying in wait with the Sagas.
Hit.
Hit.
Well done.
Oh, brilliant. Hey, Dad.
Okay, tell me you missed us.
I'm afraid to say I got a hit.
You didn't?
Yeah, see, look there. Hit 700 meters.
Good gracious.
Yeah,
well
I did miss the first time.
You have got the most modern guided missile there, probably in the world.
No, I know.
Because one thing worth saying is that the Sagas were wire-guided missiles. You had to keep the sight on the target all the time the missile was travelling towards it. It had to be fixed there, whereas you just fired it and forgot. Yes?
Yeah, it's hard enough to get the sight locked onto you, and actually have to keep it there for the entire time the missile's in the air. It would be incredible. You're shaking, you're breathing, you're nervous. I couldn't have done it if it hadn't been a lock on and then forget about it.
Very, very powerful form of anti-tank warfare. For the Israelis, quite a new ordeal.
In 1973, the Saga was turning the Sinai into a tank graveyard. The tanks, which were the pride of Israel's army, were being destroyed by Egyptian infantrymen. Israel had begun the war with around 300 tanks in Sinai. By the end of the first 36 hours, they'd lost approximately half of this number. Things were critical for the Israeli soldiers in Sinai. But that was only half the story. At the same time the Egyptians launched their attack, the Syrians had launched their bid to retake the Golan Heights.
The fertile soil of this battlefront couldn't have been in greater contrast to the arid desert of the Sinai. The Golan Heights had been a valuable prize when the Israelis captured them in 1967. These Golan Heights provided Israel with more than just good farmland. They afforded security, too. This is the Golan here, once part of Syria, occupied by Israel since 1967. The area is no more than 15 miles wide, and it ends with a steep slope down to the River Jordan. To Israelis, the Golan was a vital buffer between their heartland and Syria. Despite this, only 170 Israeli tanks and 400 soldiers were stationed in the front line on the Golan. Most of the Israeli forces were here in the north, because Israeli commanders felt this was the most likely place for any Syrian assault. But when the Syrians made their move, their 1,200 tanks and 60,000 men attacked all the way along the line. 6 hours into the battle, the Syrians' overwhelming strength was beginning to tell, and their tanks broke through down here in the more lightly defended south. By nightfall, they'd almost reached the western edge of the heights, where they could look down on the River Jordan. If Syrian tanks could now seize the vital bridges across the Jordan, they'd be able to pour across the river into Israel's heartland.
For Israeli soldiers in bunkers along the front line of the Golan Heights, the first day of the war had been a disaster. Their strong defensive positions had done little to halt the Syrian advance. This is one of the Israeli bunkers dug in to the Golan Heights, and it's got an incredibly strong construction. It's deep underground, it's reinforced concrete, and these steel plates here as well. The amazing thing about 1973 is these strong points were so difficult for the Syrians to take, they didn't even bother trying. They simply bypassed them with their tanks and kept pushing forward. By the end of the day, the Syrians had taken almost the entire southern half of the Golan Heights.
It was a nightmare situation for Israel. It had been caught unawares with far too few troops on both front lines. All Elazar, the Israeli chief of staff, could do was to mobilize every single reservist in the country.
In towns, villages and farms across Israel, news filtered out that their country was under attack. Because it was a holiday, TV and radio was off the air, and so soldiers on motorbikes had to race through built-up areas, calling up the reservists.
I was in my kibbutz on Yom Kippur when I heard the planes taking off from the Air Force Base in the area. I drove with another member of my kibbutz, who was also a company commander, to our assembly point. On the way, we said that whatever was happening, we'll probably be back home in a day or two.
Men and tanks headed out towards both fronts, but it would take 2 long days before they'd be ready to mount a counterattack. Then, on October the 8th, David Elazar announced to the world that his army had finally gone on the attack.
This morning, we started our counterattack, and we shall break and destroy completely all the attacking forces.
Elazar's first push was in the Sinai Desert.
The Egyptians had known that the Israelis would always counterattack, and they'd been lying in wait for just this moment. As soon as the Israeli tanks came into view, they let rip with devastating rocket, artillery and Saga missile fire.
The Israelis suffered heavy casualties all day. At least 50 of their tanks were destroyed or disabled. To the Israelis, it was abundantly clear this was no longer the poorly trained Egyptian army they'd fought in the past. By the end of the day, Israel was facing catastrophe. Israelis had believed that